We need to begin today by going back a few verses from where we left off last time to be reminded of the context of the material that we will be addressing today. So let's go back to verse 39 of John chapter 8. And they answered, these are the Pharisees, they answered and said to him, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, if he were indeed your father, you would do the works of Abraham. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. Abraham did not do this. Now it's important to remember that Jesus was addressing the group composed of religious leaders who believed. Back up here in verse 31, who believed, or that is, they held a strong negative conviction about Jesus. Here, Jesus refutes their claim of parentage. Since there was no evidence that they possessed the spiritual character traits of Abraham, they had no right to claim descent from Abraham. There was just no way that you could see. How could you possibly be? There are no characteristics of Abraham in the way you think, in the way, the actions you take. You do the deeds of your father. Now, after refuting their claim of being the children of Abraham, Jesus now emphasizes that their unjust actions, including their desire to murder him, revealed that they had a far different father than Abraham. Then they said to him, going on in verse 41, we were not born of fornication, or the New Revised Standard, we are not illegitimate children. We have one Father, God. They now realized that Jesus was implying that their spiritual father was not who they claimed him to be. They reacted very defensively here, brashly insisting that they were the legitimate children of God, that they had no other spiritual father than he. Verse 42, Jesus said to them, if God were your father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God. Nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. Jesus responded to their emphatic claim of being the children of God by stating that the only proof that could validate their claim would be to accept him and love him as the one who had been sent from the Father. That's the only thing that could possibly indicate that you're indeed the children of God. Verse 43, Goodspeed translates, why is it that you do not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to listen to, or as the King James has here, you cannot bear to hear my message. Jesus posed this rhetorical question in preparation for introducing the reason why they were so hostile in their rejection of him and rejection of the message that he was proclaiming. Verse 44, the Revised English Bible translates, your father is the devil, the diablos, and you choose to carry out your father's desires, what the diablos once done. Now, the Greek word diablos, which means one who engages in slander, is translated devil. The religious leaders had already proven themselves to be the offspring of the devil by their continual slandering of Jesus and the things that Jesus did. And they would continue to prove that lineage as they plotted out his death. Rather than choosing to do the will of God in order to know whether or not Jesus and his teachings had come from God the Father, as Jesus had taught them 4 days earlier. Well, he hadn't taught them, but he had taught in the temple courts 4 days earlier. Back here in chapter 7, verse 17. Instead of choosing to do the will of God, the Father, they chose to do the will of the devil. the seed of the serpent. Remember back in Genesis 3:15? The seed of the serpent, who was the devil and Satan, as we're told back in Revelation 12, verse 9, they were prophesied. The seed of Satan, that's plural seed, more than one. The seed of Satan were prophesied in Genesis 3:15 to bruise the heel of the seed, singular, of the woman. That is, they would be influenced by the devil to carry out his desire to end the physical life of the Messiah. Go back to Genesis 3:15 and read it. And that's exactly what they were doing. When Jesus says here, you choose to carry out your father's desires. His desire is to put me to death. And it was prophesied long, long ago. Going on in verse 44, Revised English Bible, he was a murderer from the beginning. The devil was a murderer from the beginning. But which beginning? It can't be, or can't mean, from the beginning or creation of the angel who became the devil, because God said, when you go back and read Ezekiel chapter 28 carefully, that angel was created perfect in all its ways. So it wasn't at that point, when it was first created, it was not a murderer. Now possibly this beginning was from the beginning of the present cosmos, since his temptation led to the first human sin that brought the death sentence on every human. The most probable beginning to which Jesus referred was from the point at which this angel became the adversary, Satan. At the time when pride, greed, and lust for power corrupted his mind, infusing this being with the spirit of murder, which drove it to rebel against God by making war in heaven. In that war, 1/3 of the angels were enticed. How? By lies and slander to follow Satan. We're told, Revelation 12, verse 3. His tail drew 1/3 of the angels. And in so doing, they sinned, bringing upon themselves, that 1/3 of the angels, the death sentence, yet to be exacted. According to Matthew 25:41, there is a lake of fire that's been prepared, in which those angels will be destroyed. The role of the devil in the future deaths of the fallen angels is clearly the role of a murderer. So he was a murderer from the beginning. So whichever one it was, he was a murderer. Verse 44 goes on in the Revised English Bible, and is not rooted, he, the devil, is not rooted in the truth, or has nothing to do with the truth, Goodspeed translates. There is no truth in him. When he tells a lie, he is speaking his own language, or as Moffat has here, expressing his own nature, for he is a liar. Humanity's first encounter with the devil was to be confronted by the original liar. The man and woman were told that if they disobeyed God, they would not surely die. Back in Genesis 3:4. No, you're not going to die. You can't believe what he tells you. That was a two-pronged lie. Not just one, but a two-pronged lie. First, they were told that God had lied to them, God who cannot lie. He told them that God had lied to them. And secondly, he told them that there would be no penalty for their disobedience. So he lied. He was a liar, as well as a murderer from the beginning. Going on in verse 44, he is a liar and the father of lies. In addition to being the original liar, the devil is the origin, the source, or we could say the father of the influence to yield to the temptation to lie, which is experienced by all of mankind. Every human being has undergone that experience. And he is the instigator. He is the father of liars. Verse 45, but because I tell you the truth, or tell the truth, you do not believe me. In direct contrast to the devil, Jesus speaks only the truth. Yet the religious leaders refuse to believe him because, like their father, they wanted nothing to do with the truth. The truth Jesus had presented was that he had come from God as the messenger of the Father, that he was from above. You can go back beginning about verse 12 or 13 here and find that he was not of this world, that he was the light of the world, and that if they wanted their sins forgiven, they must believe that he was I am. Again, we've already covered that in the previous section of John earlier in this chapter. He goes on in verse 46, which of you convicts me of sin? Or Goodspeed has, which of you can prove me guilty of sin? And if, or the New Living Translation says, and since I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? The Greek for sin in this verse is hamartia, and it means to miss the mark. In the context of what has been discussed up to this point, the obvious sin to which Jesus is referring is lying, failing to tell the truth. No one, not one of those religious leaders could prove that he was not telling the truth, but they stubbornly refused to accept any of the claims that he was making. Verse 47, he who is of God, or Moffat has, he who belongs to God, hears God's words. Therefore, you do not hear because you are not of God, or Moffat, you do not belong to God. Despite their claims, Jesus had already shown that neither Abraham nor God had been their father or was their father. Now he concludes by giving the final proof. Since they were incapable of hearing God in the words that Jesus relayed, that he had brought from the Father to them, they were clearly not God's children. Instead of hearing God, their minds were readily accepting the influence of the prince of the power of the air, the ruler of this world, as Jesus later brings out very clearly in chapter 14. The devil is the prince of this world, who is the spirit, as the Apostle Paul writes back in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2, who is the spirit that now works in the children of disobedience. Verse 48, then the Jews answered and said to him, do we not say rightly that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Since these religious leaders could not refute what Jesus had told them, they resorted to grandstanding here and ridiculing him by calling him a name that was despised by all of those in the Jewish community, and accusing him of being possessed by an evil spirit. Because they believed, again going back up to verse 31 of this chapter, they believed Jesus to be a threat to them. That's what that means there. They did all they could to dislodge any favorable impression he was having on any of those who were in the crowd that witnessed their interaction with Jesus. And so they were trying to clear things up a little bit so that they didn't look so bad in the eyes of the people. Well, you're saying this because you're a Samaritan. You've got a demon. Verse 49, Jesus answered, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. And I do not seek my own glory, or as Complete Jewish Bible has here, I do not seek praise for myself. Jesus states that he is neither out of his mind, nor attempting to take to himself the praise that should go to the Father, the praise that belongs to the Father. All of his energy was devoted to relating the teaching which he had brought from the Father, teaching that honors and heaps praise on the Father, because it all goes back to the Father, who has extended to him, as he said earlier, all the authority. Going on in verse 50, there is one who seeks and judges, or as the New English translation has, there is one who demands it, and he also judges. Now the King James and the New King James stress that Jesus is seeking glory for the Father, whereas here in the New English translation, the New Revised Standard Translation, Goodspeed, Complete Jewish Bible, and several other translations indicate that the Father requires praise to be given to his Son, to be given to Jesus. Now, both ways to be translated are correct, and yet we have the translators coming at it from a little different angle each time. Verse 51, most assuredly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, or the Complete Jewish Bible has, if anyone obeys my teaching, he shall never see death. Now, Jesus was obviously referring to never experiencing eternal death. That's the point he's making. The first death, the cessation of physical life, which is appointed to everyone according to Hebrews 9:27, is only temporary, a state of unconsciousness or sleep, which the Apostle Paul brings out pretty clearly back in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, about verses 16 and 17. Deliverance from eternal death requires believing on Jesus, believing that he indeed has been sent by the Father, which requires accepting and personally acting on the teaching that he, the messenger of the covenant, had brought from the Father to deliver in the flesh. Verse 52, then the Jews said to him, now we know that you have a demon. Abraham is dead, and the prophets. And you say, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never taste death. Now they altered Jesus' statement here from never see death, is what Jesus said. They altered it to say never taste death, showing that they did understand him to be referring to a personal experience. To see, to taste, it's all personal. A personal experience. However, by using the deaths of Abraham as well as the prophets as examples of those who had experienced death, they showed that they had failed completely to understand that he was referring here to the requirement necessary to never experience the second death, which lasts forever. It's eternal death. Revelation 20, verse 6. Talks about the second death, from which you cannot arise. Verse 53, they go on, are you greater than our father Abraham, who is dead? And the prophets are dead? Whom do you make yourself out to be? Or the Complete Jewish Bible translates, who do you think you are? Abraham, the father of the Jews, was the friend of God. Isaiah tells us that back in Isaiah, I think, chapter 41. It's also mentioned back in 2 Chronicles, I think, chapter 20 or 21. But Abraham, the father of the Jews, was the friend of God. God had spoken directly to Abraham. In fact, he appeared, physically, and spoke with Abraham. And so, God had spoken to him, and God had spoken to the prophets. How could Jesus ever consider himself to be greater than those who had been so privileged to have God in their presence and actually speak to them one-on-one? In verse 54, Jesus answered, "If I honor myself, my honor is nothing." Or as the Complete Jewish Bible has here, if I praise myself, my praise counts for nothing. It is my Father who honors me. Now, even though Jesus was indeed greater than Abraham, the prophets, and all others, rather than explaining how he was infinitely greater, he relied on the message he brought from the Father and the miraculous signs the Father enabled him to do to prove his vastly superior greatness. His words and works proved that he had come from the Father. There was no other source that would allow him to do the incredible signs and miracles that he was able to do. Going on, in verse 55, of whom you say that he is your Father. Okay, it is my Father who honors me, of whom you say that he is your Father. Yet you have not known him, but I know him. And if I say I do not know him, I shall be a liar like you. But I do know him and keep his word. Now, he says, yet you have not known him. The word known here, the word known, the only time it's used in this passage, is translated from the Greek word gnosko, which refers to knowledge gained through experience, to have interaction with, to have experience with. Jesus is telling these religious leaders that they had not had the experience needed to know the Father, since they had never had contact with him. There was no interaction between them and God, so they did not gnosko him. On the other hand, Jesus was well acquainted with the Father. Abraham and the prophets had indeed heard the voice of God, which was actually Jesus as God the Word during their brief lifetimes. But Jesus had heard the voice of the Most High God for all eternity. No one else except Jesus has had that intimate contact. So Jesus says, yet you have not known him, but I know him. And if I say I don't know him, I'm a liar like you, but I do know him. And I keep his word. I do everything he tells me to do. The word translated know 3 times here is from the Greek word oida, which means to comprehend without effort, to instinctively grasp as factual. Jesus fully comprehended everything about the Father, including the Father's thought, the Father's will, which, again, was reflected in every aspect of his life. Jesus knew the Father on a plane totally inaccessible by these Jews who claimed God to be their Father, but whose attitudes and actions certainly indicated that their Father was actually the devil, the diabolos, and not the Father. Verse 56, your father rejoiced, your father Abraham, rejoiced to see my day. Or the New Revised Standard translates this, your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. And he saw it and was glad. Now Jesus here was referring to Abraham's comprehension of the fulfillment of the plan of God. Abraham, as we all know from Hebrews chapter 11, was aware of the city of New Jerusalem. He looked for a city that has foundations, can never be destroyed, remember? All right, so Abraham was well aware of the city of New Jerusalem, which was never described in the Scriptures until God showed it to John in a vision, and John recorded at least the basic framework of the New Jerusalem there in Revelation chapter 21. Abraham was also aware that the only way one could enter that city is as a spirit, not flesh and blood, but as a spirit, which meant that the penalty of eternal death due to sin had to be removed in order to enter into the presence of God. Abraham's knowledge of how that penalty would be removed is made clear at the time when Abraham was prepared to offer up Isaac on the Mifkad altar, back in Genesis chapter 22. When he told Isaac that God would provide his own lamb. God would provide a lamb. That he would provide that lamb for the sacrifice that would be needed in the future. Would not happen at that time, but in the future. Abraham understood the resurrection from the dead, again from Hebrews chapter 11, and connected the assurance of inclusion in the resurrection to eternal life to the supreme sacrifice that Jesus, as the Lamb provided by God, would make on, as he says here, Jesus says, my day. My day. That is the time when he, God the Word, would come as a mortal in order to be offered up as that lamb. Abraham understood these things. And that's what Jesus is saying. He rejoiced to see my day. Verse 57, then the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Since Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his public ministry, according to what we read back in Luke chapter 3, he would have been 33 years old at this time. Okay? These religious leaders were drawing attention to how young he was to make such to them, an outrageous claim. For Abraham to have actually seen the day of Jesus meant that Abraham had to have known Jesus and seen him during his lifetime. That's what it would mean. Since Abraham had been dead by this point, that point in time when Jesus was saying this, for more than 18 centuries, how could he claim to be so old when he was clearly under 50 years of age? Verse 58, Jesus said to them, most assuredly, I say to you, before Abraham was, the complete Jewish Bible has, before Abraham came into being, New American Standard, before Abraham was born, I am. This is the third time in chapter 8 that Jesus identified himself as the I am. However, this is the first case in which there could be absolutely no confusion as to his meaning when he says, I am. To exist before Abraham meant that he was claiming divine status, that he was God. Verse 59, then they took up stones to throw at him. There was obviously no doubt about what Jesus had meant, because they immediately began picking up stones to put him to death for blasphemy. They believed that anyone who claimed to be God or who pronounced God's name required the death penalty, going back to the information recorded in Leviticus 24, where there's information we've gone over before. The Mishnah states that the blasphemer is not guilty until he pronounces the name. So it was blasphemy to say that he was God. But then to say that he used the name, I am, that made it now a crime punishable by death. Verse 59 goes on, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. Now, how did he hide himself? How did that happen? Because he was mortal, his body had to operate by the same laws as all who are flesh and blood. So he could not make himself invisible like the invisible man. Okay, no such thing, but we all understand. He could not make himself invisible. In fact, as we've covered at the outset, one of the main points, or one of the major points of John's account, is to prove that Jesus, who was God the Word, did come in the flesh. He was not just some manifestation, some apparition, but he was in the flesh. God was in the flesh among men. Emmanuel, God with us. And so John is pointing that out. Certainly, Jesus could have caused a blindness on the part of his adversaries so that they were unable to see him. He could have done that. Or distorted what they saw so that they didn't recognize him now. He could have done that. Most likely, however, due to the large crowds that packed the temple courts during the last day of the festival season, he simply slipped into the throng of people and made his way out through the crowd, probably in the same manner as he had done earlier when he escaped from the enraged members of the Nazareth congregation, that is the synagogue, who planned to throw him over a cliff. Remember back in Luke chapter 4. They were upset over his interpretation, the things he said after reading a passage from Isaiah 61. All right, ready to move on to chapter 9. Verse 1. The New Revised Standard translates, "As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth." Now, this occurred shortly after escaping from the temple courts. Therefore, it was still daylight, the daylight portion of the feast of the 8th day. This man, who was blind from birth, represented all of those who will be raised in the second resurrection to be judged during the third day of judgment for salvation. All who are a part of that day of judgment will have suffered a lifetime of spiritual blindness when the time that is symbolized by the feast of the 8th day finally arrives. This man was blind from birth for their entire lives. When they lived before, they were also in blindness. Since most of the blind, lame, and others with disabilities were usually brought by relatives or friends to the general area of the temple to beg, it was probably there, somewhere outside the temple gate, the golden gate, where Jesus noticed this man, maybe on one of the roads leading up to the temple entrance. So somewhere he noticed this man. Verse 2, "And his disciples asked him, saying, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?'" Now, the disciples were more curious here than compassionate by asking this question. They were probably wondering if the blind man's condition may have been a fulfillment of what was recorded back in the Torah, back in the law division in Exodus chapter 34. Hold your place in John. Let's go back to Exodus 34 and break in here to verse 6. The Lord passed by before Moses, proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering, and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, but note this, visiting the iniquity of the fathers, or as some translations have here, parents, the iniquities or the sins of the parents upon the children, and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. So, a sin of a parent or grandparent could explain the man's blindness. But if that was not the reason, possibly the man himself had sinned while in the womb, before his birth. Because some of the rabbis taught that it was possible, in trying to explain various deformities and whatever else, handicaps that babies were born with, they taught it was possible for an unborn infant to sin in the womb and to be punished by some deformity or handicap or even stillbirth. That's what they taught. Going on in John 9, and verse 3. Moffat translates, Jesus replied, "Neither for his own sin nor for his parents'. It was to let the work of God be illustrated in him," or as the New English translation has here, to be illustrated in through what happens to him. You're going to see some things now. This miracle that Jesus was about to perform was to reveal something more about the work of God in the fulfillment of his plan by what would happen now to this blind man. Jesus was about to reveal a most wonderful part of God's plan. That all who have had life, who have lived but have never seen the light of the world, will one day have life and see that light, the light of the world. People have not been lost, as so many in worldly Christianity say, because they've not heard the name of Jesus. And they've died and they've gone to the deep recesses of whatever their imaginary eternal hellfire is. No. God shows very clearly that's not what happens. And Jesus, by this miracle, shows exactly what does happen. Verse 4, "I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work." In the context of the fulfillment of the meaning of the feast of the 8th day, the last group with which Jesus can work and lead to salvation will be those in what we call the white throne judgment, which is given to us very clearly back in Revelation 21, beginning in verse 11 in that particular section. Because after that final day of judgment comes to a close, night will descend. Night will descend. Night will come for all those who have refused God's offer of deliverance from eternal death during each of the 3 days of judgment for salvation. The essence that makes their resurrection to life possible, the spirit in man, will be destroyed, which clearly is done according to Matthew chapter 28. And once that spirit in man is destroyed, everything that, all the information necessary to reassemble that individual will be gone, forever cutting them off from the light of the world. They are eternally dead. The final day of salvation will be ended, and no further work involving salvation will be performed. That's the night that he's talking about, as far as those who have not seen the light of the world or have not accepted what the light of the world has offered. Because the day of the Lord, it will be a day. There will be no night for those who live. For those who are delivered, who receive salvation, the day of the Lord continues on forever. Verse 5, Jesus says, "As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Just as he had proclaimed to the crowd in the temple courts earlier that morning, Jesus now tells the blind man that he was the light that God promised to give to the world. Remember, back in Psalm 118, the very one that talks about the religious leaders rejecting Jesus Christ. It also talks about God giving light. All who are raised up in the second resurrection will be told the same thing as this man, this blind man. The only way to salvation, the only way to find salvation is to come to him, to approach the light of the world. Verse 6, the New Revised Standard translates, "When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud," or clay, some translations have, "with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes." Now the mud or clay comes out of the earth. It's what it is, dirt. Spreading it on the eyes of the blind man symbolized the spiritually blind being under the darkness of the earth. That is, in the grave. In the grave. It also symbolized the veil that has been and will be spread over the minds of all whom God has not yet selected for judgment prior to the return of the Messiah. That veil is mentioned back in Isaiah 25, verse 7. We cover it every feast. The veil which spiritually blinds them and prevents them from seeing the truth. All right? Now that's what that mud that was placed on the man's eyes, under the earth, and again, there is this veil that's there, preventing seeing the light. Now, according to the Pharisees, before you go further, according to the Pharisees, building and kneading were prohibited activities on the Sabbath. Making the mud, spitting in the dirt and mixing the saliva into the dirt to have the mud, required kneading. Not like bread, but on a miniature scale, it was kneading. And packing the mud on the eyes of the blind man amounted to building, because you're building up a layer, one layer after another. Because Jesus had done these things with the intent to heal, which was also a rabbinic tradition, but a prohibition on the Sabbath, the religious leaders would condemn him for breaking their Sabbath prohibitions. They're the ones that came up with these prohibitions. They're not in the Bible. That's what they came up with. That's their prohibitions. Verse 7, "And he said to him," Jesus told the blind man, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which is translated, Siloam simply means sent. So he was sent. This pool, which was the source of water that was used in the water pouring ceremony during the 7 days of the Feast of Tabernacles, this source was fed by water from the Gihon spring. It was located south of the temple complex in Jerusalem, which meant that it was a considerable distance from the area where the beggars would all congregate and where Jesus obviously met this man. Jesus did not offer to escort the man to lead him to the pool, nor did he ask one of his disciples to do so. Jesus expected the man to expend individual effort to follow his instructions, even though he could not see where he was going. In other words, Jesus commanded him, it's going to be necessary for you to walk by faith, which will be the same requirement imposed on those who are resurrected for the judgment pictured by the feast of the 8th day. They too, just like all of us, we must walk by faith. Verse 7 goes on, "So he went and washed, and came back seeing." Washing the clay from his eyes symbolized being washed by baptism and having the veil, which caused spiritual blindness, to be removed. Verse 8, I'll read from the Complete Jewish Bible. "His neighbors and those who previously had seen him begging said, 'Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?' Some said, 'Yes, he's the one,' while others said, 'No, but he looks like him.' However, he himself said, I'm the one. After so many years of looking down at this man sitting on the ground begging, they simply didn't recognize him when he stood up and made eye contact with them. Totally different perspective. Verse 10, therefore, they said to him, how were your eyes opened? He answered and said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I received sight. His use of the phrase here, a man called Jesus, indicates this man that had been blind had no previous knowledge or understanding of who Jesus was or what Jesus taught or what Jesus had done. He was oblivious. He didn't know. This will be the condition of the vast majority of those who will be resurrected for judgment, to be judged for salvation in the white throne judgment, again pictured by the feast of the 8th day. Verse 12, then they said to him, where is he? He said, I do not know. They brought him, who formerly was blind, to the Pharisees. Now it seems his neighbors wanted to make sure that the religious leaders were aware of this incredible miracle that had occurred. And it's likely that when they took him to the Pharisees, they took him to the Sanhedrin, to the council, because that's where most of them would be on that day. Verse 14, now, it was a Sabbath. Note this, it was a Sabbath. The Greek simply says it was Sabbaton, when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. In the Greek, there is no definite article linked to Sabbaton, which is Sabbath. No definite article. Hence the translation, a Sabbath. The term a Sabbath indicates the day was most likely an annual Sabbath or holy day, rather than the weekly Sabbath, which is generally referred to as the Sabbath. The Sabbath would be the weekly Sabbath, a Sabbath, an annual Sabbath. This is another indication that the time of this event was on the annual Sabbath of the feast of the 8th day. Verse 15, then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. He said to them, he put clay on my eyes, or he put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Very simple. That's what happened. Therefore, some of the Pharisees said, this man that did this is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such miracles, or signs, plural, as other translations have? How can he do such signs? And there was a division among them. The Pharisees, we find, were not unified in how they viewed Jesus. Some were aware of other miracles, obviously, that Jesus had done because of the plural of signs. Signs is used. The group who refused to agree that Jesus was a sinner posed a question similar to the factual statement that was made by Nicodemus at an earlier time, back here in chapter 3. Of course, it was possible, maybe very probable, that it was Nicodemus and those who were allied with him who did so at this time. It may have been Nicodemus who said, oh, how could he, you can't consider him to be a sinner. Look the signs. Note here, back in chapter 3, verse 1, it says, there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. The same came to Jesus by night. Going on down here, it says he came to Jesus and said to him, Rabbi, we, plural, not just Nicodemus, so there were others, there were other rabbis. We know that you are a teacher come from God, For no one can do these signs, plural, they were aware of a number of signs, that you do unless God is with him. And so back here again in chapter 9, it's very likely that it was Nicodemus speaking up, but it's not pointed out in the Scripture. All right, going on in verse 17. They said to the blind man again, "What do you say about him? Because he opened your eyes." In other words, what do you conclude about him? The man who had been blind said, "He is a prophet." The previously blind man was well aware of the miracles that God had worked through some of the prophets, such as Elijah back in 1 Kings 17, and Elisha, 2 Kings chapter 4, how each of those two prophets, they did something incredibly beyond anybody's imagination. They raised some children from the dead. And so this man, miracles, great miracles, we got to associate it with prophets. Look at Moses and what Moses did. The prophets are the ones who can do the miracles, so he's got to be a prophet. Verse 18, but the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. And they asked them, saying, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered them and said, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age," or the New English translation has here, "he is a mature adult. Ask him. He will speak for himself." The Pharisees were hoping that they could prove the man had not been born blind. That way they could dispute the miracle and claim that the return of the man's sight was coincidental with what Jesus had done. That's what they were trying to do. The man's parents, we find here, were only willing to answer the first two of the three questions that were posed by the Pharisees. Verse 22, why didn't they not answer the other? Verse 22, I'll read from the New English translation. His parents said these things because they were afraid of the Jewish religious leaders. Note, fear. The religious leaders, of all things, of all people, to instill fear in people. Who would ever think? They were afraid of the Jewish religious leaders, for the Jewish leaders had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Christ, to be the Messiah, would be put out of the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, "He is a mature adult, ask him." They didn't want to get kicked out of the synagogue. Those who were excommunicated from the synagogue became social outcasts. There were three levels of severance that were in play back in those days. The first lasted for 30 days, 1 month, during which the offender was required, you won't believe this, they were required to stay at least 6 feet away from every other person. Whoa! How history repeats itself. The second severance was more strict. It required an extension of the 30 days, also the requirement to be cursed and prohibited from being hired to work, prohibited from buying or selling except for basic needs. And the third level of severance was even worse. It was complete severance from all future religious and social activities. That was what the people were up against. If the Pharisees decided that you are going to be kicked out of the synagogue, this is what you faced. Verse 24, so they again called the man who was blind, the Pharisees did, and they said to him, "Give God the glory." Now, the Complete Jewish Bible brings this out a little bit differently. Swear to God that you will tell the truth. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered and said, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. Most translations give the meaning of the New King James, give God the glory, that the Pharisees were admonishing the man to give God the credit for being the one who healed instead of Jesus. Okay, God's the one who healed. However, the context of the event occurring in an arraignment by the court of the Sanhedrin shows that it was more likely that the Pharisees were actually demanding him to confirm by an oath of what had happened to him, which is indicated by the Complete Jewish Bible. Swear to God that you will tell the truth. Verse 26, then they said to him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? The man answered, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? The man was very tired of being badgered by these unsympathetic, calloused, self-righteous Pharisees, so he began to get rather sarcastic with them. Verse 28, then they reviled him, or New English Translation says they heaped insults on him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. So they disparaged the man, stressing how ignorant he was. They were disciples of Moses, who were fully trained and schooled in the Holy Scriptures. There was nothing, the man, was nothing more than a poor, unschooled, ignorant peasant who had been taken in by another man who had received none of the necessary training to qualify him as a rabbi. Well, he was just a Galilean. He had no formal training. Now, the irony of their claim to know that God spoke to Moses, yet not even know from where Jesus had come, was the fact that Jesus was the God who spoke to Moses. Verse 30, the Revised English Bible. The man replied, how extraordinary! Here is a man who has opened my eyes, yet you do not know where he comes from? He gets very caustic now with the Pharisees. He emphasizes that they, the men who claim to know God and to be God's representatives on earth, did not know the origin of the one who had given him sight. Yet, he who had been blind to that very day, to just maybe an hour or a couple of hours before, he could clearly see from where Jesus had come. Verse 31, now we know, the man goes on, now we know that God does not hear sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he, God, hears him. The man points out to them what every untrained Jew in Jerusalem understood. God will not come to the aid of a sinner, but he will involve himself with those who are humble and obedient, as Isaiah 66 verse 2 brings out. Isaiah 66 verse 2, where God says in the latter part of this verse, on this one will I look, God says, on him who is poor and of a contrite, humble spirit, and who trembles at my word. That's what every Jew understood, at least all of the religious Jews. Back in chapter 9, verse 32, since the world began, or the Complete Jewish Bible, in all history, New American Standard, since the beginning of time, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. The man went on. anyone claiming to be as close to God as you Pharisees say you are should recognize without hesitation that the one who gave me sight could come from no other place than from God. Yet you say, you Pharisees, that you don't know where he came from. That leads me to question how close you yourselves are to God, if you can't even recognize this. Verse 34, the New Living Translation has, "You were born a total sinner," they answered. Total sinner, complete sinner. You were born that way. Now, whether they made that assumption because he was born blind and attributed the fact that, he had to be born a sinner because he was born blind, I don't know. But then they say, "Are you trying to teach us?" And they threw him out of the synagogue. It was impossible for these Pharisees, these religious leaders, to respond to the man's flawless argument. Therefore, they attacked his character and excommunicated him, which meant prohibiting his family and friends from associating with him unless they too wanted to be censured from the synagogue. This callous act was done to a man who, for the first time in his life, was now able to see with his own eyes his family and friends. Verse 35. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said to him, "Do you believe in," or King James says on, "do you believe on the Son of God?" He answered and said, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe on him?" Like the blind man, those raised up on the 8th day, the day pictured by the 8th day, the festival of the 8th day, will need to be educated concerning the plan of God. They will need to be educated. Who it is through whom salvation can be achieved. They're going to have to be shown. Many lived and died, past times in history, totally oblivious. And so this man symbolizes those. Verse 37, "And Jesus said to him, 'You have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you.' Then he said, 'Lord, Master, I believe.' And he worshipped him." First time Jesus spoke with him was while he was still blind. The man had not actually seen Jesus until this moment when he came back. The man had progressed in spiritual understanding from referring to Jesus as the man they call Jesus to now calling him his master and worshiping him. So he had made a tremendous amount of stride in understanding. Once those in the second resurrection are raised to life, back here in Ezekiel 37, once they're raised to life, the veil that had blinded their minds when they had previously lived will be removed, and their eyes will all be opened. And like the blind man, they will be introduced to the Savior. Notice here in verse 12 of Ezekiel 37, I'll read this from the New International. It says, "Therefore, prophesy and say to them," God is telling Ezekiel, prophet Ezekiel, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. O my people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel." This is the time of the second resurrection, depicted again beginning in Revelation 21, verse 11. "I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord." A lot of these Pharisees that Jesus spoke to that very day, that he was addressing at this very time here in John chapter 9, they're going to understand. You will know that I am the Lord. I am. When I open your graves and bring you up from them, I will put my spirit in you and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken. These Pharisees and all others. And I have done it, declares the Lord. Back in chapter 9, verse 39. And Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind." Or as the New Living Translation, I believe, brings out much better, "and to show that those who think they see, that they are blind." They think they see. They think they know it, but they don't. Jesus here is not claiming to be judging these people for salvation, as he will at his second coming. But rather, when he talks here about "for judgment I have come," it's to make the decision, to make a judgment, to make the decision to remove the spiritual blindness of some and reveal the blindness of others who think that they're not blind. Some who were in darkness were enabled to see the light. Remember chapter 1 of John? We covered chapter 1, verse 5 in particular. Some who were in darkness saw the light, while others who thought they were in the light remained in the darkness and never comprehended it. Verse 40, "Then some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these words and said to him, 'Are we blind also?' Jesus said to them, 'If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, we see. Therefore your sin remains.'" These Pharisees had received extensive rabbinic training in interpreting the Holy Scriptures. And they believed themselves to be spiritually enlightened. That's what they thought about themselves. Motivated by their self-righteousness, which prevented them from acknowledging their blindness, they very resentfully here asked Jesus if he thought they suffered from spiritual blindness. Why, we know we don't. Are you saying that we do? Jesus told them that because they had elevated themselves to positions of spiritual leadership, presenting themselves to the people as teachers of the truth, they were in effect claiming to see. They claimed to see, told the people that they could see. Therefore, as God declared back in Deuteronomy 18, verse 19, Deuteronomy 18:19. They were being held accountable. God says, if you don't listen, when I send to the one like Moses, you're going to be accountable. And he declared there that they were being held accountable for their sin of refusing. Jesus is telling them, you're being held accountable for refusing to accept Jesus as the prophet like Moses and heeding the message that he brought. You scoff at the message, you say it's not coming from the Father. He tells you that it is. And not only are they being held accountable for that, but Jesus says you're also being held accountable for using fear tactics to force the people to do the same, to reject me. They knew the Scriptures which prophesied of him, but they were unwilling to accept him for who he was. Unlike this man who had previously been blind, who had been healed, whom they had rashly excommunicated. So that brings us to the end of chapter 9, and be ready in the next installment for chapter 10.